Green for green. Well, today's House committee hearing on Superstorm Sandy was meant to find ways to get help to the victims who need it, still do. However, a few Democratic members had something else on their mind.
The elephant in this room that needs to be spoken about is the impact of climate change and the increasing intensity of storms and the variedness of the storms, the breadth of a storm like Sandy. And I think that we have to rebuild and rethink our infrastructure in those terms.
A hurricane colliding with a nor'easter, and whiteout snow conditions. That is what has lots of scientists thinking about the effects of climate change.
All right, to Climate Depot's Mark Morano on well, whether that's fair to just throw this into the mix. Mark, what do you think?
Well, what they're doing is these are cheap political points. And notice I'm saying political because there's no science to back up what they're saying. Hurricane experts have looked at this. We're at the longest period since at least 1900 without a major landfalling hurricane hitting the U.S. On whether you're looking at floods or droughts, all these other things are showing no trends over 60, 80 years. People are always trying to draw short trends, you know, over 3 years, 10 years. But the bottom line is, Congress is not only doing this at FEMA hearings, the senators, like Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, they're doing this at defense authorization. They're putting in climate change riders. They're trying to ride Hurricane Sandy all the way to the bank. And the bank is setting the stage for a carbon tax here in Washington. And that's what they're trying. Ultimately, that's what the Treasury looks like to be preparing to do. And there's fear that even Republicans are going to do it as a revenue neutral part of tax reform, even consider it. So ultimately, that's what this is about. It's about more money from the government shamelessly using Hurricane Sandy.
Well, what I worry about is if any of these congressmen had been around in the late 50s and early 60s when we had a whole lot of storms in the last big cyclical wave of them, whether they would have responded the same way and exacted the same sort of climate change initiatives that would have cost business trillions in retrospect for what was a cyclical pattern. And we do it again. I just think before you plunk down the kind of change they're talking about, you better be damn unequivocally sure that climate change, and no one's disputing that, you know, there's been a warming up. What's open for ample and considerable debate is whether man is exclusively to blame for that. And I think to then punish companies, to pay for a problem that they might not be responsible for in a dicey economic recovery globally, if that's what you call it, you're adding nonsense to sin here.
Yes, in fact, if we go back to the, quote, old normal, they always talk about global warming causing a new normal. The old normal was the 1950s, which you referenced. We've had a dramatic decrease in large F3 or bigger tornadoes since the 1950s. Hurricanes, as I mentioned, dramatically down. Drought, floods. So the bottom line is they're actually, even if we were causing it, their solution is a carbon tax. Their solution are EPA regulations. And a carbon tax was just analyzed by a climatologist and found to be climatologically useless in addressing climate issues. However, as the Washington Post knows, in an editorial said a few weeks ago, quote, it will bring in serious money, in quotes. $125 billion a year is what Washington is drooling over at the moment. And if they can use Sandy, if they can exploit the victims, if they can turn science on its head and try to claim that global warming caused Sandy, then they'll do it to get, quote, serious money of $125 billion a year. Believe me, there will be no shortage of congressmen making hay out of this issue.
Well, my other big fear is that in money that should be raised right now to help Sandy victims, very few of those dollars are going to make it to Sandy victims. And here's the case again where Americans have a very big heart, a lot of our legislators as well, but they don't think after the fact whether it might be a good idea to help those folks affected on the ground rather than set up these huge bureaucracies that presumably are going to help them on the ground. There is something wrong with the process that reduces the amount of money you get to a fraction of what was panned out.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially the money gets laundered through the Washington bureaucracy. And we've seen this years ago, whether you're talking about welfare or any other program. By the time the money actually reaches the intended victims, it's been essentially fleeced. And that's Washington. That's one of the things Washington is really effective at. That's one of the things you got to give them a gold star for. They know how to fleece. They know how to get each level of bureaucracy to get theirs, essentially.
Well, you seize on the emotional moment, and this is an emotional moment. Yeah. Mark, thank you very much. Well, all he wanted for Christmas was a job.